The phone rang at 11:37 on a Tuesday night, jarring me from the legal documents spread across Harold's mahogany desk. 3 weeks had passed since my adoptive father's funeral, and I was still processing the reality that his $12 million estate now belonged to me. The voice on the other end was gravelly unfamiliar, yet he claimed to know me intimately. "Dallas, this is your real father, Frank. We need to talk." My hands trembled as I gripped the receiver, staring at the inheritance papers that had just transformed my life. This man who abandoned me at 8 years old simply because I was born female now wanted something from me. After 24 years of silence, why was he calling now? Standing in the rain 3 weeks earlier, I watched them lower Harold Mitchell into the ground at Riverside Cemetery. The small gathering of mourners consisted mainly of his business associates and longtime employees from Mitchell Construction Company. I clutched a single white rose, remembering the day this gentle man rescued me from the Nebraska State Children's Home when I was 8 years old. Harold had appeared in the stark visiting room of that group home like an angel in a wool overcoat. His silver hair was neatly combed, his kind eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled at me, reading quietly in the corner. While other potential parents walked past my chair without a second glance, Harold sat down beside me and asked about my book. It was a worn copy of Charlotte's Web, and I told him how I identified with Wilbur, the unwanted pig who found unexpected friendship. That meeting came 6 months after the most devastating day of my childhood. My biological parents, Frank and Susan, had driven me to the group home in their rusted pickup truck on a crisp October morning. I remember pressing my face against the cold window, watching familiar farmland blur past, not understanding why my small suitcase was packed in the truck bed. Frank kept his eyes on the road while Susan stared out her window, neither one able to look at me directly. When I finally asked where we were going, Frank's voice was harsh and final. "We can't afford to feed you anymore, Dallas. The farm needs boys who can work the land and carry on the family name. Girls are just useless mouths to feed." His words cut through my 8-year-old heart like a rusty blade. At the group home, Susan finally turned around, her eyes, red-rimmed but dry. "Be a good girl," she whispered, then quickly got back in the truck. Frank never even got out. I stood on the concrete steps, clutching my stuffed rabbit, watching their taillights disappear down the gravel driveway. That was the last time I saw them. The social worker, a tired woman named Mrs. Patterson, led me inside and assigned me a bed in a room with 3 other girls. That night I cried myself to sleep, not understanding what I had done wrong to deserve abandonment. Days turned to weeks and weeks to months. Other children came and went, finding families who wanted them, while I remained invisible in the corner with my books. Then Harold appeared. He visited 3 times before officially filing adoption papers, bringing me small gifts each visit. A new book, a box of colored pencils, a stuffed dog to replace my worn rabbit. He told me about his late wife, Emma, who had always wanted children but couldn't have them. He spoke of his empty house with its large library and sunny kitchen, where Emma used to bake cookies. "Would you like to come home with me, Dallas?" he asked during his 3rd visit. "I promise you'll never want for anything, and you'll always have a place where you belong." His voice carried such genuine warmth that I nodded through my tears, unable to speak. Harold kept every promise. He enrolled me in the best schools, encouraged my love of reading, and taught me about his construction business during weekend drives to job sites. He attended every school play, every parent-teacher conference, and every milestone moment in my life. When I graduated valedictorian from high school, he cried openly in the auditorium. When I earned my business degree from the University of Nebraska, he gave me my own office at Mitchell Construction. Now, sitting in his study after the funeral, I held his will in my trembling hands. Everything was mine. The company, the investments, the beautiful Victorian house on Elm Street, even his collection of first edition novels. But there was something else. Attached to the will was a sealed envelope with my name written in Harold's careful handwriting, along with instructions to open it only after his death. My fingers shook as I broke the wax seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. Harold's words, written in his final weeks, made my blood run cold. My dearest Dallas, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are now a wealthy woman. I must warn you that your biological family has been tracking your success through newspaper articles about our business. They will come for the money. I have seen Frank watching our house on 3 separate occasions in the past year. Trust no one who shares your blood, my dear girl. They gave up the right to call you family the day they drove away from that group home. All my love, Harold. 2 days after reading Harold's warning, Frank appeared on my doorstep like a specter from my past. I recognized him immediately despite 24 years of aging. His face was deeply lined and weathered from decades of outdoor work, his gray hair thin and unkempt. His calloused hands clutched a manila envelope against his worn denim jacket. "Hello, Dallas," he said, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone I remembered from childhood. "I know this is unexpected, but we need to discuss some legal matters concerning your inheritance." He looked past me into the foyer, his eyes scanning the polished hardwood floors, the crystal chandelier, the oil paintings that Harold had collected over the years. I could see him calculating, estimating, appraising every visible asset. His gaze lingered on the antique grandfather clock in the corner, a piece Harold had told me was worth $15,000. "What do you want, Frank?" I kept my voice steady, though my heart hammered against my ribs. I deliberately didn't call him father. He had forfeited that title long ago. "Can I come in? This isn't a conversation for the front porch." He stepped forward, assuming I would move aside, but I held my ground. "Whatever you have to say, you can say it right here." Frank's jaw tightened the same expression I remembered from when I was 8 and asked too many questions about why we were so poor. "Fine, have it your way." He opened the manila envelope and pulled out several official-looking documents. "These are the original adoption papers from when you were taken from us. It turns out Harold Mitchell's adoption wasn't properly finalized. There were irregularities in the process." My stomach dropped, but I forced myself to remain calm. "That's impossible. Harold showed me the completed adoption decree years ago. Documents can be forged, Dallas. The state of Nebraska has been investigating adoption irregularities from that time period. Seems your precious Harold had connections in the family court system." Frank's voice carried a smugness that made my skin crawl. He was lying. I knew he was lying. But the documents looked authentic, complete with official seals and signatures. My legal knowledge from working alongside Harold told me that even false documents could create expensive court battles. "What exactly are you trying to accomplish here?" I asked. Frank's expression softened artificially like an actor slipping into character. "I'm not trying to hurt you, Dallas. You're still my daughter no matter what happened in the past. But facts are facts. Your mother and I never legally surrendered our parental rights. That makes your inheritance questionable at best." The words hit me like physical blows. After everything Harold had given me, after building a life based on his love and guidance, this man wanted to destroy it all with paperwork and legal technicalities. "I suggest we meet tomorrow to discuss this properly," Frank continued. "Bring your lawyer, I'll bring mine. We can work out an arrangement that's fair to everyone involved." The next afternoon, I sat across from Frank and his attorney at Romano's restaurant downtown. Frank had cleaned up for the occasion, wearing a rumpled suit that looked borrowed. His lawyer, a thin man named Peterson with predatory eyes, spread documents across the table between our untouched meals. "The situation is quite straightforward," Peterson began. "My client's parental rights were never legally terminated. The adoption that transferred custody to Harold Mitchell was processed incorrectly, making it null and void. As Mr. Wallace's biological daughter, your inheritance is technically part of his family estate." I stared at Frank, searching for any trace of the father I might have loved under different circumstances. Instead, I saw only desperation masked as determination. "You gave me away because I was worthless to you. Now you want me back because I'm worth $12 million. Frank shifted uncomfortably but maintained eye contact. "That was a different time, Dallas. We were struggling to keep the farm afloat. Your mother was sick, and I was barely holding things together. We thought we were doing what was best for you. By abandoning an 8-year-old child, by giving you opportunities we couldn't provide." Frank's voice rose slightly. "Look how well you turned out. You got an education, learned the business world, became successful. That wouldn't have happened if you'd stayed on a failing farm." Peterson cleared his throat. "The circumstances of the past aren't relevant to the current legal situation. What matters is that Mr. Wallace's parental rights were never properly terminated, which calls into question the validity of your inheritance." I leaned back in my chair, studying both men carefully. "Let me guess, you want money to make this problem go away?" Frank at least had the decency to look ashamed. "The farm is in foreclosure. We owe $400,000 in back taxes and loans. The bank is seizing everything next month unless we can pay the debt. So you're not here for a family reunion. You're here for a bailout." "You're our daughter," Frank said quietly. "Family helps family. Harold stole you from us, filled your head with ideas about being better than where you came from. But blood is blood, Dallas. You owe us something for giving you life." The audacity of his words left me speechless. This man who had abandoned me, who had told me I was a useless mouth to feed, now claimed I owed him gratitude for my existence. I wanted to throw my water glass in his face, but Harold had taught me that emotional responses weakened your position in negotiations. "I need time to consider this," I said finally. Peterson slid a business card across the table. "We'll need an answer within 48 hours. After that, we'll be forced to file a formal challenge to the inheritance in probate court. The legal fees alone will cost you more than resolving this privately." As I walked to my car, Frank caught up with me in the parking lot. "Dallas, wait. I know this is hard to understand, but I really did miss you. Not a day went by that I didn't wonder how you were doing." I turned to face him, seeing something in his eyes that might have been genuine regret. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine what it would have been like to have a father who fought for me instead of one who sold me for his own convenience. "If you really missed me, Frank, you would have called. You would have written. You would have tried to be part of my life before Harold died and left me money." I got into my car and drove away, leaving him standing alone in the parking lot. But as I pulled into my driveway, I found another surprise waiting for me. A young woman sat on my front steps, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing jeans and a faded sweater. When she looked up at me, I saw my own eyes staring back. "Dallas." The young woman stood up slowly, brushing off her jeans. "I'm Melody, your sister." I felt the world tilt slightly off its axis. In all my childhood memories of the farm, I couldn't recall Frank and Susan mentioning another child. Yet here stood a girl who shared my facial features, my eye color, even the stubborn cowlick that made my hair stick up on the left side. "I know this is overwhelming." Melody continued, her voice soft and uncertain. "Dad told me he was coming to see you and I couldn't stay away. I've wondered about you my entire life." She looked to be in her mid-20s with the same slight build I inherited from our mother's side. Her clothes were worn but clean, and she carried herself with a nervous energy that reminded me of a startled deer. "How long have you been waiting here?" I asked, unlocking my front door. "About an hour. I hope that's okay. I drove down from Grand Island as soon as Dad told me he'd found you." She hesitated at the threshold. "Could I maybe come in? I promise I'm not here to cause trouble. I just wanted to meet my big sister." Against my better judgment, I let her inside. Melody's eyes widened as she took in the spacious foyer, the elegant staircase, the expensive furnishings Harold had accumulated over his lifetime. "Wow, Dad wasn't exaggerating about you being wealthy now." She caught herself and blushed. "I'm sorry, that came out wrong. I'm not here about money." I led her to the kitchen and put on a pot of coffee, studying her face, while she looked around in amazement. The resemblance was undeniable, but something felt off. Her mannerisms seemed calculated, her expressions of wonder just a bit too theatrical. "Tell me about yourself, Melody. What do you do? Where do you live?" I work at a diner in Grand Island, nothing fancy. Just trying to make ends meet, you know. She accepted the coffee mug I offered with both hands as if warming herself. I live in a little apartment above the restaurant. It's not much, but it's mine. What about our parents? How are they doing? Melody's expression grew somber. Mom has been in and out of psychiatric facilities for the past few years. Dad struggles to take care of her and keep the farm running. It's been really hard on both of them. I'm sorry to hear about Susan. What's wrong with her? Severe depression and anxiety. The doctors say it started after... Melody paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. After they gave you away. She never forgave herself for that decision. This was not what I expected to hear. Frank had portrayed their choice as purely practical, driven by economic necessity and traditional gender roles. The idea that Susan had suffered psychological consequences complicated my feelings about the situation. Dad said they regretted it immediately, Melody continued. They tried to get you back, but the adoption had already gone through. Harold Mitchell apparently had lawyers who made sure they couldn't interfere. That's not how adoption works, Melody. There are waiting periods, appeal processes. If they really wanted me back, they could have fought for me. Melody's eyes filled with tears. I know it sounds hard to believe, but Dad was young and didn't understand his legal rights. By the time they found a lawyer who could help them, it was too late. The system protected Harold because he had money and connections. Part of me wanted desperately to believe this revised version of my abandonment. The idea that my biological parents had suffered remorse, that they had tried to reclaim me, offered a kind of emotional healing I hadn't realized I needed. They searched for you for years, Melody said softly. Dad hired private investigators, contacted adoption agencies, even put ads in newspapers hoping you might see them and reach out. When those newspaper articles started appearing about Harold's construction company with your name mentioned as his daughter, they finally knew where you were. Why didn't they contact me then? Dad was afraid you'd hate them. He thought you were better off with your new life, that reaching out would only cause you pain. Melody set down her coffee mug and looked directly at me. But when Harold died, Dad realized this might be the last chance to make things right. Not for money, Dallas, for family. I wanted to believe her. The lonely 8-year-old inside me wanted to believe that my parents had loved me, that giving me away had broken their hearts, that they had spent decades trying to find me. But Harold's warning echoed in my mind, and my adult instincts told me to be cautious. Would you like to stay here tonight? I heard myself asking. I have a guest room upstairs. We could talk more, get to know each other properly. Melody's face lit up with what appeared to be genuine joy. Really? You'd want me to stay? You're my sister. Of course I'd want to spend time with you. That evening, I showed Melody to the guest bedroom and gave her some of my clothes to sleep in. We talked until nearly midnight, sharing stories about our childhoods, our dreams, our disappointments. She told me about growing up on the farm, about helping Dad with the animals and learning to drive the tractor when she was 12. I told her about Harold's kindness, about building Mitchell Construction into a successful business, about the education and opportunities he had provided. For the first time since Harold's death, I didn't feel completely alone in the world. Having a blood relative, someone who shared my history and understood where I came from, filled an emptiness I hadn't realized existed. Over the next 3 days, Melody integrated herself into my daily routine. She helped me organize Harold's personal belongings, listened while I shared memories of my adoptive father, and offered comfort during moments when grief overwhelmed me. She seemed genuinely interested in learning about the business and asked thoughtful questions about my plans for the future. But on the 4th morning, I woke up early to find Melody's bedroom door ajar and the room empty. I assumed she had gone downstairs for coffee, but when I reached the kitchen, I found her standing in Harold's study with her phone pressed to her ear. The bank statements are in the top drawer, she was saying quietly. Yes, I got pictures of everything. The investment portfolio is worth about $8 million, and there's another $2 million in checking accounts. She paused, listening to the person on the other end. No, she doesn't suspect anything. She actually trusts me now. My blood turned to ice as I realized what I was hearing. Melody was photographing my financial documents and reporting the details to someone else. I backed away from the doorway and crept upstairs to my bedroom, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. From my bedroom window, I could see Melody's car parked in my driveway. I used my phone to take pictures of her license plate, then called my attorney, Margaret Stone, leaving an urgent voicemail requesting an emergency meeting. When Melody came upstairs 20 minutes later, I pretended to still be sleeping. She knocked softly on my door and called out, "Dallas, I'm going to run to the store for groceries. I thought I'd make you breakfast." "That sounds wonderful." I called back, working to keep my voice normal. "Take your time." As soon as her car pulled out of the driveway, I raced downstairs to Harold's study. The filing cabinet where I kept my most sensitive financial documents had been disturbed. Papers were slightly out of order and one folder was upside down. Melody had been thorough in her search. I photographed everything exactly as I found it, then called Margaret Stone again. This time she answered. "Margaret, I need to see you immediately. I think I'm being scammed by my own family." When Melody returned 2 hours later with groceries and a bright smile, I was waiting for her in the kitchen. "How was the store?" "Fine, just picked up some things to make your favorite pancakes." She began unpacking the bags, chattering about her plans for the day. "I thought maybe we could drive out to see the farm this afternoon. Dad would love to see you again, and Mom is having one of her good days." "That sounds nice," I said carefully. "By the way, I couldn't help but notice you were on the phone earlier. Everything okay?" Melody's hands stilled for just a moment before resuming their unpacking motion. "Oh, that was just my boss at the diner. I had to call in sick for a few more days. I hope you don't mind me extending my visit." "Of course not. Who else did you call?" "No one else." "Why do you ask?" I studied her face, looking for tells. Her eyes darted away from mine and she began arranging groceries with unnecessary focus. "I thought I heard you talking to someone for quite a while." "Nope, just the one call." Melody's voice carried a forced lightness. "You must have heard me talking to myself. I do that when I'm nervous." That afternoon, I excused myself to meet with Margaret Stone while Melody prepared lunch. In Margaret's office, I showed her the photographs of my disturbed files and played the recording I had made of Melody's phone conversation using an app on my phone. Margaret's expression grew increasingly grim as she reviewed the evidence. "Dallas, you're being set up for identity theft, at minimum possibly a much larger financial fraud. This woman has access to all your personal information, your banking details, your social security number. You need to get her out of your house immediately and change all your passwords and account numbers." "But she's my sister, Margaret. I can see the family resemblance." Family members commit fraud against each other every day. In fact, they're often the most successful at it because they have the target's trust. Margaret leaned forward in her chair. "I'm going to run a background check on this Melody woman. In the meantime, don't let her know you suspect anything. Just get her out of your house as safely as possible." When I returned home, Melody was setting the table for lunch. She looked up with a welcoming smile that now seemed predatory rather than warm. Perfect timing. I made chicken salad sandwiches. "Actually, Melody, something has come up. I need to go out of town for a few days on business. You should probably head back to Grand Island tonight." Her smile faltered slightly. "Oh, I was hoping we could spend more time together. Could I maybe stay here while you're gone? Keep an eye on the house for you." "That's very thoughtful, but I'd prefer not to leave anyone here alone with all of Harold's valuable items." Melody's expression hardened for just a moment before she recovered her pleasant mask. "Of course. I understand completely. When will you be back?" "I'm not sure yet. I'll call you." That evening, I watched from my bedroom window as Melody loaded her car and drove away. But instead of heading toward Grand Island, she turned in the direction of downtown. I followed at a distance, staying far enough back to avoid detection. Melody drove to a rundown motel on the outskirts of town and parked outside room 12. A man emerged from the room and approached her car. Even in the dim parking lot lighting, I could see he was young, maybe 30, with tattooed arms, and the swagger of someone who considered himself dangerous. They talked for several minutes before Melody handed him a manila envelope similar to the one Frank had carried. The man counted through what appeared to be documents or photographs, then nodded approvingly. I took pictures of both Melody and the man with my phone's camera, then drove home with a sick feeling in my stomach. My biological family wasn't seeking reconciliation. They were running a con game, and I had been the perfect mark. The next morning, Margaret called with the results of her background check. Dallas. There's no record of anyone named Melody Wallace in Grand Island, Nebraska. The woman staying in your house is an imposter. Margaret Stone's law office occupied the top floor of a gleaming downtown building, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city Harold had helped build. I sat across from Margaret's massive oak desk watching her review the evidence I'd gathered about the woman calling herself Melody. The fingerprints you lifted from the coffee mug matched someone named Angela Morrison from Omaha. Margaret said, sliding a police report across the desk. She has a record of identity fraud and has been arrested twice for scamming elderly widows out of their life savings. The photograph attached to Angela Morrison's arrest record showed the same face that had smiled at me across my kitchen table, the same eyes that had convinced me we were sisters. The betrayal cut deeper than Frank's transparent greed because I had allowed myself to hope for family connection. "There's more," Margaret continued. "The adoption papers Frank showed you are completely forged. I contacted the Nebraska Department of Health and Human Services this morning. Harold's adoption of you was processed correctly and legally finalized in 1999. Frank Wallace signed away all parental rights voluntarily and received counseling about the permanence of his decision." Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by anger. So Frank lied about everything. Not everything. He really is your biological father, and he really does owe $400,000 in back taxes and loans. But his legal claim to your inheritance is non-existent. Margaret pulled out another file. Unfortunately, that's where our good news ends. Frank filed a wrongful death lawsuit against you this morning. The papers felt heavy in my hands as I read through Frank's accusations. He claimed that Harold had manipulated a vulnerable child through psychological coercion, that the adoption was fraudulent, and that Harold's estate should be divided among his biological heirs as compensation for emotional damages. This is insane, Margaret. Can he actually do this? Anyone can file a lawsuit, Dallas. Winning is another matter entirely. But Frank's attorney is clever. He's not challenging the adoption directly since those records are sealed and legally ironclad. Instead, he's arguing that Harold committed elder abuse by alienating you from your birth family and that you were essentially brainwashed into believing his version of events. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Saw the news about your lawsuit. Maybe we should talk about settling this privately. Your loving sister, Melody." Margaret noticed my expression as I read the message. "What's wrong?" "Angela Morrison, or whoever she really is, wants to negotiate." I showed Margaret the text. "How did she even get my number?" "She had access to your house for 4 days, Dallas. She probably copied everything in your address book, downloaded your contacts, maybe even planted listening devices." Margaret's voice carried a grim urgency. "We need to sweep your house for surveillance equipment and get you a new phone with a different number immediately." That afternoon's news broadcast made my stomach churn. Channel 7 ran a story titled "Local Heiress Accused of Family Fraud," with my photograph prominently displayed. The reporter interviewed Frank outside the courthouse, where he played his role perfectly. "I just want justice for my daughter," Frank said, dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief. "Harold Mitchell convinced Dallas that her real family didn't love her, that we were bad people who abandoned her for money. But we were young parents struggling to survive, and we thought we were giving her a better life. We never stopped loving her or trying to find her." The news story painted me as a cold-hearted woman who had inherited millions while her poor biological family lost their farm. Frank's performance was masterful, hitting every emotional note that would generate public sympathy. The reporter even included footage of the family farm's foreclosure notice and Susan's psychiatric facility. My phone, which Margaret had not yet replaced, rang constantly with calls from reporters, curiosity seekers, and people offering legal advice. I stopped answering after the third call turned out to be someone claiming they had information about Harold's secret criminal activities. The next morning brought worse news. Margaret called at 6:30 with an urgent tone I'd never heard from her before. "Dallas, you need to get down here immediately. Frank's lawsuit has attracted attention from the state attorney general's office." In Margaret's conference room, I met Assistant Attorney General Rachel Hendricks, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who carried herself with prosecutorial authority. She spread documents across the table with the precision of someone building a case. "Ms. Wallace, we've received allegations that your inheritance may involve tax evasion and money laundering through Harold Mitchell's construction company," Hendricks said without preamble. "We're opening an investigation into the source of Mr. Mitchell's wealth and whether proper taxes were paid on his estate." "That's ridiculous," I replied, though my voice sounded weaker than I intended. Harold's business was completely legitimate. I worked there for years and handled many of the financial records myself. According to Mr. Frank Wallace and his attorney Harold Mitchell operated several shell companies and hid income in offshore accounts to avoid paying federal taxes. They've provided bank records and corporate documents that suggest systematic fraud over a period of 20 years. Margaret leaned forward intently. "May we examine these alleged documents?" Hendricks slid a thick folder across the table. As Margaret and I reviewed the papers, my heart sank. The documents appeared authentic, showing wire transfers to Caribbean banks and corporate structures that seemed designed to hide assets. But I had never seen any of these accounts or companies during my years working at Mitchell Construction. "These documents are forged," I said firmly. "I managed Harold's books for the past 10 years. None of these accounts exist." "We'll certainly investigate their authenticity," Hendricks replied. "But until we can verify the legitimacy of your inheritance, we're freezing all assets associated with Harold Mitchell's estate." The room spun around me as the implications hit. No access to bank accounts, no ability to operate the construction company, no way to pay for legal representation or even basic living expenses. Frank had found a way to destroy my life without winning his lawsuit. Margaret immediately requested an emergency hearing to challenge the asset freeze, but the earliest court date available was 3 weeks away. In the meantime, I was essentially destitute, despite being worth $12 million on paper. That afternoon, I hired private investigator James Wright on Margaret's recommendation. James was a former FBI agent who specialized in financial fraud cases. His office was spartanly furnished, but organized with military precision. "I've seen this type of scam before," James said after reviewing my case files. "Frank Wallace isn't smart enough to orchestrate something this sophisticated. He's working with professional criminals who target inheritance recipients." "How do they choose their victims?" "Obituaries in newspapers, probate court filings, social media posts about funeral services. They look for recently orphaned individuals who inherited significant wealth and have complicated family histories that create emotional vulnerabilities." James pulled out a map of Nebraska and marked several locations with red pins. "In the past 2 years, I've investigated 4 similar cases across the state. Each victim was an adoptee who inherited money, and each was approached by alleged biological family members with forged documents and emotional manipulation tactics." "What happened to the other victims?" "2 of them paid the extortion demands and lost hundreds of thousands of dollars. One fought back and won, but only after spending more in legal fees than the scammers originally demanded. The 4th victim," James paused. "She committed suicide rather than face the public humiliation and legal battles." The weight of what I was facing crashed over me like a physical force. These weren't desperate family members seeking help. These were predators who had identified me as prey and were systematically destroying my life for profit. "I want to fight them, James, but I need to know exactly what we're up against." "Leave that to me. I'll start by tracking down the real identity of your fake sister and mapping out their criminal network. In my experience, people who run these scams rarely stop at one victim. If we can connect them to other cases, we can build a federal case that will put them away for a long time. That evening, I sat in Harold's study surrounded by boxes of his personal papers, searching for any evidence that might contradict the forged documents. Harold had been meticulous about record keeping, and every legitimate transaction was documented and filed properly. As I worked through his correspondence, I found a series of letters from Frank dating back 15 years. Frank had indeed been monitoring my life, sending Harold angry demands for money and threatening to expose the truth about the illegal adoption. Harold had kept copies of his responses, each one stating firmly that the adoption was legal and that Frank had no claim to contact with me. One letter from Frank was particularly disturbing. I know where Dallas works and what car she drives. I know her daily schedule and her weekend habits. If you don't start sending money to help her real family, I might have to approach her directly and tell her what kind of man really raised her. Harold's response was swift and decisive. Any attempt to contact Dallas or interfere with her life will result in criminal charges and a restraining order. Your parental rights were terminated voluntarily and legally. You have no claim to her, her affections, or her inheritance. Reading these letters, I realized that Harold had been protecting me from Frank's harassment for years without ever telling me about it. His warning letter about Frank watching the house wasn't paranoia, but experience-based knowledge of a real threat. The next morning brought a new crisis. Margaret called with news that Frank's attorney had convinced a judge to issue a temporary restraining order, preventing me from selling or transferring any assets pending the outcome of the lawsuit. Even worse, the local newspaper had published an editorial questioning whether I deserved my inheritance. The situation is escalating beyond normal legal channels, Margaret warned. Frank's team is using media pressure and public opinion to force a settlement. They're betting that you'll pay them off rather than endure months of negative publicity. I won't give them a penny, Margaret. Harold worked too hard building this legacy for me to hand it over to criminals. Then we need to be prepared for this to get much worse before it gets better. As if summoned by Margaret's words, my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw a man I didn't recognize holding a large manila envelope. When I opened the door, he thrust the envelope into my hands. Dallas Wallace. You're being served with a subpoena to appear in federal court next Thursday. Have a nice day. Inside the envelope were documents demanding that I testify before a grand jury, investigating Harold's alleged tax evasion and money laundering. Frank had managed to turn a civil lawsuit into a criminal investigation with me as the primary target. But as I read through the subpoena, I noticed something that gave me hope. The investigation was being conducted by the same FBI field office where James Wright had worked for 15 years. If anyone could navigate federal law enforcement and uncover the truth about Frank's criminal conspiracy, it would be someone with inside knowledge of how these investigations really worked. I called James immediately. They're trying to make me the target of a federal criminal investigation. Can you help me? Actually, this might be the break we need, James replied. Federal investigators have resources that private investigators don't. If we can convince them that you're the victim rather than the perpetrator, they'll help us take down Frank's entire network. What do you need from me? Everything you've discovered about Angela Morrison, all the forged documents Frank provided, and complete transparency about Harold's legitimate business records. We're going to prove that you're not just innocent, you're the victim of a sophisticated criminal conspiracy. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a spark of hope. Frank had escalated the situation beyond his ability to control, and now federal law enforcement would examine every aspect of his claims under the microscope of criminal investigation standards. The hunters were about to become the hunted. James Wright's investigation into Frank's background yielded disturbing results that explained the sophistication of the scam targeting me. In his office the following Tuesday, James spread surveillance photographs and official documents across his desk like pieces of a complex puzzle. Your biological father has been running inheritance scams for at least 8 years. James began pointing to a timeline he had constructed. But he's not the mastermind. He's working for a man named Trevor Kane, who operates a network of con artists specializing in adoptee fraud across 6 states. The photographs showed Frank meeting with various individuals at truck stops, diners, and parking lots throughout Nebraska and Iowa. In each image, Frank appeared to be receiving instructions or delivering information to people who looked like professional criminals rather than desperate farmers. Trevor Kane has a sophisticated operation, James continued. He monitors obituaries and probate filings to identify recently orphaned adoptees who inherit significant money. Then he researches their background to find biological family members who can be recruited as inside assets. Recruited how? Usually through a combination of bribery and blackmail. In your father's case, Kane paid off most of the farm's debts in exchange for Frank's cooperation in the scam against you. But Kane also has leverage over Frank through Frank's other children. James pulled out a thick file containing birth certificates and school records. After giving you away, Frank and Susan had 4 more children, 3 sons named Bobby, Carl, and David, plus another daughter named Jennifer, who was also given up for adoption when she was 6 years old. The revelation that my parents had abandoned another daughter hit me like a physical blow. They gave away 2 daughters. Jennifer was placed for adoption in 2003, but her case was different from yours. She was adopted by a family in Colorado who had no significant assets. When Jennifer's adoptive parents died in a car accident last year, she inherited only their modest house and a small life insurance policy. Kane's network had no use for her. Where is she now? That's where this gets darker. Jennifer has been institutionalized for severe mental illness since her adoptive parents' death. According to her medical records, she suffered a complete psychological breakdown when she learned about her biological family's pattern of abandonment. She's currently in a long-term psychiatric facility in Denver, unable to care for herself. The idea that another daughter had been destroyed by Frank's actions filled me with rage. My biological father wasn't just a desperate man seeking financial help. He was a serial child abandoner whose decisions had devastated multiple lives. What about the sons? I asked. Bobby is currently serving a 7-year sentence for armed robbery. Carl was arrested last month for running a methamphetamine operation out of a trailer in Grand Island. David is the only one not in legal trouble, but he's a functioning drug addict who works sporadically as a farmhand. James showed me mugshots of my biological brothers, men whose faces carried the same genetic markers as mine, but whose eyes held the hollow look of people who had given up on legitimate paths to success. The family I had imagined reuniting with was actually a collection of damaged individuals whose lives had been shaped by Frank's poor choices and criminal associations. Kane uses Frank's children as leverage to ensure his cooperation, James explained. He pays their legal fees, funds their addictions, and provides financial support in exchange for Frank's participation in inheritance scams. It's a sophisticated form of family-based organized crime. What about Susan? Is she really in a psychiatric facility? Yes, but her mental illness isn't caused by guilt over giving you away. Susan has been in and out of institutions for 20 years due to severe bipolar disorder and substance abuse. Frank uses her condition as part of his emotional manipulation strategy with targets. The woman I had imagined as a mother suffering from regret about abandoning me was actually someone whose mental illness predated my adoption and had likely contributed to the decision to give me away. Every emotional hook Frank had used to manipulate my feelings was based on carefully constructed lies. James pulled out another set of photographs, these showing Angela Morrison meeting with Frank and a man I didn't recognize. "This is Trevor Kane," James said, pointing to a tall man with silver hair and expensive clothes. "He's the one really running this operation." Cain looked like a successful businessman rather than a criminal mastermind. His appearance was designed to inspire trust and confidence, exactly the kind of person who could convince victims that his elaborate scams were legitimate legal matters. Cain has been using the same basic playbook for years, James explained. He identifies a target, recruits their biological family as inside assets, then uses professional actors like Angela Morrison to create emotional connections that make the victims vulnerable to manipulation. Once the victim's defenses are down, he introduces forged documents and legal threats to extract money. How many people has he scammed? We've identified at least 12 victims across Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, Colorado, and South Dakota. Total losses are probably close to $3 million. But Cain is careful to keep individual payouts under federal thresholds that would trigger automatic FBI involvement. Until now. Exactly. By targeting your $12 million inheritance, Cain got greedy. The scale of this scam automatically makes it a federal case, which gives us access to resources that local law enforcement doesn't have. James opened a laptop computer and showed me FBI surveillance footage of Cain's operation. Federal agents had been tracking his network for 6 months after a victim in Kansas contacted the FBI when local police couldn't help her recover money she had lost to a similar scam. The FBI has been building a case against Cain's entire network, James said. Your situation isn't just about getting your inheritance back. It's about shutting down a criminal enterprise that has destroyed dozens of lives. What happens now? Tomorrow you testify before the federal grand jury. But instead of being the target of the investigation, you'll be the star witness against Cain, Frank, Angela Morrison, and everyone else involved in this conspiracy. That evening, I drove out to the family farm for the first time since my childhood. The property was exactly as I remembered it, a small farmhouse with peeling paint, a barn that leaned precariously to one side, and fields that had been left unplanted for several seasons. Frank's pickup truck was parked in the driveway next to a newer SUV that I didn't recognize. Through the kitchen window, I could see Frank sitting at the same table where he had eaten meals during my childhood, talking to someone whose back was turned to the window. I parked far enough away to avoid being seen and used the telephoto lens on my camera to photograph the license plate of the SUV. Then I called James Wright to report what I had found. That vehicle is registered to Trevor Cain, James confirmed after running the plates. He's probably there to coordinate Frank's testimony for your grand jury appearance tomorrow. This gives us an opportunity to gather additional evidence. Should I confront them? Absolutely not. Cain is dangerous, and he doesn't know yet that the FBI is investigating his operation. If he realizes the scam has been exposed, he'll disappear, and we'll never be able to prosecute him. As I watched the house, Frank and Cain emerged from the kitchen and walked toward the barn. Cain carried a briefcase, and his body language suggested he was giving Frank specific instructions. They disappeared into the barn for nearly an hour. When they finally emerged, Cain handed Frank an envelope and shook his hand before getting into the SUV and driving away. Frank stood in the farmyard watching Cain's taillights disappear, then went back into the house. I waited another 20 minutes before driving closer to the house. Frank's kitchen light was on, and I could see him sitting at the table counting what appeared to be cash from the envelope Cain had given him. The sight of him being paid for his betrayal of his own daughter filled me with a cold fury that surprised me with its intensity. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Hope you're ready for tomorrow's testimony. Remember that family loyalty works both ways. Trevor. Cain knew about my grand jury appearance and was threatening me through anonymous messages. But instead of feeling intimidated, I felt empowered. Every threat, every lie, every manipulation attempt was building the federal case against him. I took screenshots of the threatening text and forwarded them to James Wright, then drove home to prepare for the most important testimony of my life. Tomorrow, I would tell federal investigators the complete truth about Frank's scam, Cain's criminal network, and Harold's legitimate business practices. The next morning, I met with Assistant U.S. Attorney Patricia Chen at the federal courthouse downtown. Chen was a prosecutor who specialized in complex financial fraud cases, and her reputation for thoroughness and preparation was legendary among defense attorneys. Ms. Wallace, your testimony today will be crucial to our case against Trevor Kane's organization, Chen explained as we reviewed my prepared statement. We need you to walk the grand jury through every contact you've had with Frank Wallace, Angela Morrison, and anyone else connected to this scam. Will Frank be there? He's scheduled to testify after you, but he doesn't know that we've uncovered his connection to Kane's network. Frank still believes he's part of a legitimate lawsuit against you rather than the target of a federal criminal investigation. As I entered the grand jury room, I felt the weight of not just my own case, but the cases of all Kane's other victims. 12 people from across the Midwest had lost their inheritances, their peace of mind, and in Jennifer's case, their mental health to this criminal enterprise. The 23 grand jurors listened intently as I recounted every detail of Frank's manipulation, Angela Morrison's deception, and the systematic way Kane's network had targeted me for financial exploitation. I provided copies of all the forged documents recordings of threatening phone calls and evidence of the surveillance operation Frank had conducted against Harold and me for years. When I finished my testimony 3 hours later, the grand jury foreman asked one final question. Ms. Wallace, what would you like to see happen to the people who did this to you? I want them prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, I replied without hesitation. Not just for what they did to me, but for what they've done to all their victims. Some crimes are too serious for mercy. As I left the courthouse, I saw Frank sitting in the witness waiting area, still dressed in his borrowed suit, and apparently unaware that his criminal conspiracy had been exposed. In 2 hours, he would face the same grand jury that had just heard my testimony, but his experience would be very different from mine. The hunters had finally been cornered. 3 days after my grand jury testimony, James Wright called with urgent news that changed everything about the case against Trevor Kane's criminal network. Federal agents had arrested Angela Morrison during a traffic stop in Iowa, and her cooperation with prosecutors was revealing the full scope of Kane's operation. Morrison is talking to save herself from a 20-year sentence, James explained over the phone. She's given the FBI details about 12 other active scams across 6 states, plus information about Kane's money laundering operation through legitimate businesses. What about Frank? He's been arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and extortion. But here's the interesting part. Morrison says Kane is planning to eliminate Frank as a loose end because Frank knows too much about the operation. The idea that Frank might be in physical danger complicated my feelings about him. Despite everything he had done, despite his greed and manipulation, he was still my biological father. The 8-year-old girl inside me, who had loved him before understanding his true nature, felt a flicker of concern for his safety. Where is Kane now? That's why I'm calling. Morrison says Kane is meeting with Frank today to tie up loose ends before fleeing the country. The FBI has been tracking Kane's movements, and they believe the meeting is happening at your family farm. Should I be worried about my own safety? Kane doesn't know you've testified to the grand jury yet, but he's definitely aware that his scam failed. Morrison says he's angry about losing the biggest score of his career, and he blames Frank for botching the operation. That afternoon, FBI agent Sarah Chen contacted me directly with a request that surprised me. Ms. Wallace, we'd like you to participate in a controlled operation to gather evidence against Trevor Kane. Are you willing to wear a recording device and confront Kane and Frank at the farm? Isn't that dangerous? We'll have agents positioned around the property to ensure your safety. But we need Kane to admit his role in the conspiracy on tape in order to secure his conviction. He's too smart to confess during a formal FBI interrogation. What would I have to do? Drive to the farm and demand that Kane stop harassing you. Let him think you're there to negotiate a settlement. Kane's ego won't let him resist bragging about how clever his scam was, especially if he thinks you're still vulnerable to manipulation. The idea of confronting Kane and Frank simultaneously terrified me, but the opportunity to gather evidence that would put them away permanently was too important to pass up. I'll do it. 2 hours later, I wore a small recording device hidden in my jacket as I drove toward the family farm. FBI agents were positioned in unmarked vehicles along the rural road, and Agent Chen monitored my conversation through a wireless transmitter. Frank's pickup truck and Kane's SUV were both parked in the farmyard when I arrived. Through the kitchen window, I could see both men sitting at the table, surrounded by boxes and suitcases. It looked like Kane was preparing to leave the state quickly. I parked near the house and walked to the front door, my heart pounding so hard I worried the recording device might pick up the sound. Before I could knock, Kane opened the door with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Dallas Wallace, how nice of you to visit your old family home." Kane was tall and well-dressed with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being in control. "Your father and I were just discussing your situation." Frank sat at the kitchen table looking haggard and defeated. His hands shook as he lifted a coffee cup to his lips, and his eyes darted nervously between Kane and me. Whatever Kane had told him during their meeting had clearly frightened him. "I came to ask you to stop this harassment," I said, addressing Kane directly. "I know you're the one behind the forged documents and the fake lawsuit. What do you want to make this end?" Kane laughed with genuine amusement. "Straight to business. I like that about you, Dallas. You're much smarter than your pathetic father led me to believe." Frank flinched at Kane's words but said nothing. I noticed bruising on Frank's face that hadn't been there during his grand jury testimony, suggesting that Kane's methods of persuasion had become physical. "Frank here was supposed to deliver you as a cooperative victim," Kane continued. "Instead, he let some fake sister nonsense convince you to trust him, then lost control of the entire operation. Do you know how much money your stubbornness has cost me?" "I don't care about your money, Kane. I want you to leave me alone." "Oh, I don't think you understand the situation, Dallas. Your inheritance investigation triggered a federal probe into my business operations. 12 of my associates have been arrested, and my entire network is being dismantled because your father couldn't execute a simple con game." Kane moved closer to me, and I could see the cold calculation in his eyes. This wasn't just a criminal upset about a failed scam. This was a predator whose entire operation had been destroyed, and he wanted revenge. "The way I see it, you owe me approximately $3 million in lost revenue," Kane said. "That's what I would have collected from my other operations if the FBI hadn't started investigating because of your case." "I'm not paying you anything." "Oh, but you are. Because if you don't transfer $2 million to my offshore account within 24 hours, I'm going to release some very interesting information about Harold Mitchell's business practices." Kane pulled out a folder containing photographs and documents I had never seen before. "Did you know your beloved adoptive father used his construction company to launder money for organized crime families? Those building projects you helped manage were fronts for drug trafficking operations." My blood ran cold as I examined the documents. They appeared to show legitimate Mitchell construction projects that were actually being used to hide criminal proceeds. If these documents were authentic, Harold's entire legacy would be destroyed, and I could face criminal charges as an accomplice. "These are forgeries just like everything else you've created," I said, though. Uncertainty crept into my voice. "Are they your father, Frank, worked construction for some of Harold's competitors back in the day? He has inside knowledge about how the bidding process really worked, who got the no-bid contracts, why certain projects cost twice their estimated budgets." Frank finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dallas, I'm sorry. I told him about Harold's business because I thought it would help with the lawsuit. I didn't know he would use it to hurt you this way." Kane backhanded Frank across the face with casual violence. "You don't speak unless I tell you to speak." He turned back to me with renewed focus. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to wire $2 million to my account, and I'm going to disappear forever. If you don't, these documents get released to the FBI and every news outlet in Nebraska. And if I pay you, how do I know you won't come back for more?" Because I'll be living comfortably in a country that doesn't extradite to the United States. Your money buys my permanent absence from your life. Cain was offering me the same deal he had probably offered his other victims pay once for the promise of peace. But I knew from James Wright's investigation that Cain never kept such promises. He would take my money and continue threatening me until I had nothing left. I need time to arrange the wire transfer, I said, stalling for time while the FBI gathered evidence from our recorded conversation. You have until noon tomorrow. After that, your precious Harold's reputation gets destroyed along with your inheritance. Cain's expression hardened. And Dallas, don't even think about involving the police. I have associates who know where you live, what car you drive, and what your daily routine looks like. Is that a threat? It's a promise. Cross me and you'll end up like your adoptive father. Old Harold's heart attack wasn't as natural as the death certificate claimed. Frank's head snapped up in shock. You told me Harold died of natural causes. Cain smiled coldly. Harold died because he was asking too many questions about why certain people were watching his house and following his daughter. Sometimes coincidences need a little help to happen naturally. The recording device in my jacket captured Cain's admission that he had been involved in Harold's death. What I had believed was grief-induced paranoia on Harold's part was actually accurate awareness of a real threat to both our lives. You killed Harold, I whispered. I eliminated a problem. Harold was getting too protective, asking too many questions, making it difficult for Frank to gather information about your assets. Heart medication is easy to tamper with when you have the right connections. Frank stood up abruptly, his face white with shock and horror. You murdered him. You said Harold just died of old age complications. Sit down, Frank, before you join him. Cain's hand moved to his jacket and I caught a glimpse of a gun holster. Your usefulness to me ended the moment Dallas started investigating our operation. The only question now is whether I let you live long enough to see your daughter pay for your mistakes. The kitchen door burst open as FBI agents swarmed into the house with weapons drawn. Agent Chen led the team shouting commands for Cain and Frank to get on the ground with their hands visible. Cain reached for his weapon but stopped when 3 red laser dots appeared on his chest. Trevor Cain, you're under arrest for conspiracy extortion, money laundering, and murder, Agent Chen announced. As agents handcuffed Cain and read him his rights, he stared at me with pure hatred. This isn't over, Dallas. I have friends who will finish what I started. Frank collapsed into a chair as agents secured the scene. I didn't know about Harold, he said through tears. I swear I didn't know he killed Harold. I just wanted money to save the farm. Agent Chen approached me as paramedics checked Frank for injuries from Cain's assault. Ms. Wallace, you did an excellent job gathering evidence. Cain's confession to Harold's murder gives us everything we need for a life sentence. What happens now? Cain will be charged with first-degree murder along with the fraud and extortion charges. Frank will likely receive a reduced sentence in exchange for testifying against Cain and his associates. The other victims of Cain's scams will finally get justice. As I watched Cain being loaded into a federal transport vehicle, I felt a complex mixture of relief, satisfaction, and grief. Justice was being served, but it couldn't bring Harold back or undo the damage Cain's network had inflicted on so many families. Frank approached me as agents prepared to take him into custody for processing. Dallas, I know I don't deserve forgiveness for what I've done, but I need you to know that giving you away was the biggest mistake of my life. Not because of the money, but because I lost the chance to watch you become the amazing woman you are today. For the first time since this nightmare began, Frank's words sounded genuinely heartfelt rather than manipulative. Why should I believe you now? Because I have nothing left to gain by lying. The farm is gone, my other children hate me, and I'm going to prison for a long time. The only thing I can do now is tell you the truth. Harold gave you a better life than I ever could have, and I'm grateful to him for that. I studied Frank's face looking for signs of deception, but finding only genuine remorse and regret. I'll consider visiting you in prison after the trial is over. That's all I can promise right now. That's more than I deserve, thank you. As FBI agents drove Frank away, I stood in the farmyard where my childhood had ended 24 years earlier. The 8-year-old girl who had been abandoned here was finally free from the shadow of that betrayal, and the woman I had become was strong enough to choose forgiveness without accepting further abuse. Harold's murder would never be acceptable, but at least his killer would face justice. Kane's criminal network was destroyed, and his other victims would receive closure along with financial restitution from seized assets. The final confrontation was over, but my journey toward healing was just beginning. 6 months after Trevor Kane's arrest, I sat in the visitor's room of the Nebraska State Psychiatric Hospital, waiting to meet someone whose existence I had only recently learned about. Through reinforced glass, a young woman approached the visiting table with hesitant steps. Jennifer Wallace shared my eye color, my stubborn cowlick, and the genetic markers of our biological family, but her face held a fragility that spoke of profound psychological trauma. "You're really my sister." Jennifer's voice was soft, uncertain, filtered through the trauma of abandonment and mental illness. She was 26 years old, but seemed younger, her hands fidgeting nervously with the sleeve of her hospital gown. "Yes, I'm Dallas. I've been looking for you since I learned about your existence 6 months ago." I had spent considerable effort tracking Jennifer down through adoption records and medical facilities, driven by the need to know if any other member of my biological family could be saved from the destruction Frank had caused. The doctors say Frank gave me away too when I was 6. I remember some things about the farm, but they're mixed up with bad dreams and medication side effects. Jennifer's eyes darted around the visiting room as if looking for threats that existed only in her damaged psyche. "I was 8 when they gave me away. We both deserved better parents than Frank and Susan." "Do you think we're bad people?" The doctors ask me that a lot, whether I think I'm bad because my parents didn't want me. Jennifer's question carried the weight of years of therapy and self-examination. "No, Jennifer, we're not bad people. We were children who needed love and protection, and our parents failed in their most basic responsibility. Their inability to care for us was about their limitations, not our worth." I had spent months preparing for this conversation, working with Dr. Amanda Foster, a psychiatrist who specialized in adoption trauma. Dr. Foster had warned me that Jennifer's mental illness was severe and possibly irreversible, but that family connection might provide some measure of healing. "I've been thinking about what it means to be family," I continued. "I had an adoptive father named Harold who showed me that real family is about choice commitment and love, not just shared DNA. But I also think you and I have a different kind of connection because we survived the same experience." Jennifer nodded slowly, processing my words with the careful attention of someone whose thoughts moved through the fog of psychiatric medication. "I dream about a little girl sometimes, someone who looked like me but older. The doctors said it might be a false memory, but maybe it was you. Maybe it was. I used to dream about having a sister, someone who would understand what it felt like to be unwanted by the people who gave us life." Over the next 2 hours, Jennifer and I shared fragments of memory from our early childhood. Her recollections were incomplete and sometimes contradictory, but certain details matched my own experiences. The smell of Susan's coffee, the sound of Frank's truck starting before dawn, the cramped bedroom where we might have slept in bunk beds. "The social worker who placed me with my adoptive family said Frank and Susan couldn't handle 2 girls," Jennifer said. "They kept me longer because they hoped I might develop into a useful farm worker, but when I showed signs of behavioral problems, they decided I was defective too." Jennifer's adoptive parents had been loving but unprepared for the challenges of raising a severely traumatized child. Her psychological breakdown began in adolescence and worsened after their deaths in a car accident. With no family support system and limited financial resources, she had been institutionalized when her mental health deteriorated beyond her ability to function independently. "I've set up a trust fund for your care," I told her as our visit neared its end. You'll have access to the best psychiatric treatment available, and when you're ready, there are residential facilities that can help you transition to independent living. Why would you do that for me? We barely know each other. Because you're my sister, and because I can afford to help. Harold left me more money than I could spend in several lifetimes, and I think he would approve of using it to help family members who need it. Even family members who are crazy. You're not crazy, Jennifer. You're wounded. There's a difference. Wounds can heal with proper care and time. As I drove away from the psychiatric hospital, I thought about the concept of inherited trauma and how the same abandonment experience had affected Jennifer and me so differently. The quality of our respective adoptive families had made the crucial difference in our outcomes. Harold's love and stability had given me the foundation to build a successful life, while Jennifer's adoptive parents, despite their good intentions, hadn't been equipped to handle the depth of her psychological damage. The following week, I attended Frank's sentencing hearing at the federal courthouse. He had pleaded guilty to conspiracy and fraud charges in exchange for testimony against Kane's criminal network. The judge sentenced him to 8 years in federal prison with the possibility of parole after 5 years. Before sentencing, Frank was given the opportunity to make a statement to the court. He stood at the defendant's table wearing an orange jumpsuit, looking older and more broken than during our previous encounters. Your Honor, I know that nothing I say can undo the harm I've caused my daughters or the other victims of my criminal activities, Frank began. I gave away 2 children because I believed girls were less valuable than boys, and that decision destroyed their lives and mine. I participated in a conspiracy to defraud the daughter I had already abandoned, adding betrayal to the original crime of abandonment. Frank turned to look at me in the gallery. Dallas, I don't expect your forgiveness, and I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that watching you testify against Kane's network, seeing the strength and integrity you've developed, despite my failures as your father, has been the proudest moment of my life. Harold Mitchell gave you everything I failed to provide: love, stability, education, and most importantly, the belief that you deserved good things in life. The courtroom was silent as Frank composed himself before continuing. I also want to apologize to Jennifer, who couldn't be here today, but deserves better from the man who was supposed to protect her. My choices as a young father were driven by ignorance, poverty, and cultural attitudes that I now recognize as profoundly wrong. Girls are not less valuable than boys. Children are not possessions to be discarded when they become inconvenient. Judge Patricia Martinez listened to Frank's statement with professional neutrality before delivering her own remarks. Mr. Wallace, your participation in Mr. Kane's criminal enterprise targeted vulnerable individuals and caused immeasurable psychological harm. However, your cooperation with federal investigators and your acceptance of responsibility for your actions demonstrate some capacity for personal growth. After the sentencing, I met briefly with Frank in a secure conference room. Federal marshals would transport him to a minimum security facility in Colorado within the week. I meant what I said in court, Frank told me. I'm proud of who you became, even though I had nothing to do with it. I'm going to visit Jennifer regularly and make sure she gets the help she needs. She's family, and family takes care of each other. That's more kindness than either of us deserves from you. It's not about what you deserve, Frank. It's about what kind of person I choose to be. As I left the courthouse, I felt a sense of closure that had been missing since Harold's death. Frank would serve his sentence and hopefully find some measure of redemption during his incarceration. Jennifer would receive the psychiatric care she needed to heal from childhood trauma. Kane was awaiting trial for first-degree murder and would likely spend the rest of his life in prison. The legal battles were over, but the real work of healing was just beginning. I had spent the past 6 months liquidating Harold's construction company and establishing the Mitchell Foundation for foster care reform. The foundation would build group homes for older children who were unlikely to be adopted, providing them with educational opportunities and life skills training that would help them transition to independent adulthood. On a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after Harold's death, I stood on the construction site of the Foundation's first group home. The building was designed to house 12 teenagers aged 14 to 18, with private bedrooms, study areas, and common spaces that would feel like a real home rather than an institution. Sarah Martinez, the Foundation's director, walked with me through the nearly completed structure. Sarah had been a social worker for 15 years and understood the specific needs of children who had been abandoned or removed from their biological families. "The first residents will move in next month," Sarah explained as we toured the facility. "We've already identified 8 teenagers from various group homes around the state who will benefit from this environment." "What about staff training?" "We're implementing trauma-informed care protocols and hiring counselors who specialize in attachment disorders. Every staff member will receive extensive training in helping children who have experienced abandonment abuse or neglect." As we walked through the building, I thought about the 8-year-old girl who had spent 6 months in a state-run group home, feeling invisible and worthless. These children would have opportunities I couldn't have imagined during my own foster care experience, individual therapy, educational support job training programs, and most importantly, adults who were committed to their long-term success. "There's one more thing," I told Sarah as we finished our tour. "I want to establish a scholarship program for children aging out of foster care. Full college tuition room and board plus stipends for books and living expenses." "That's incredibly generous, Dallas. How many scholarships per year?" "As many as we can afford. The Foundation's endowment can support at least 20 full scholarships annually, possibly more as our investments grow." That afternoon, I visited Harold's grave for the first time since his funeral. His headstone was simple granite, with his name, dates of birth and death, and an inscription I had chosen: "Beloved Father who taught that family is built on love, not blood. I miss you every day." I said aloud, feeling slightly foolish, but needing to express thoughts I hadn't been able to share with anyone else. "I hope you would approve of what I'm doing with your legacy. The Foundation will help children who are facing the same abandonment I experienced, but they'll have opportunities I never could have imagined." I told Harold about Frank's sentencing, Jennifer's treatment progress, and the construction of the first group home. I talked about the scholarship program and my plans to expand the Foundation's services to include mental health support for adoptees who were struggling with identity and abandonment issues. "I learned something important from everything that happened with Kane and Frank." I continued. "You always told me that true family is based on choice and commitment, not biological connection. But I also learned that forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation. I can forgive Frank for abandoning me without allowing him back into my life. I can provide for Jennifer's care without pretending we have a normal sister relationship." As the sun began to set, I placed a bouquet of white roses on Harold's grave and walked back to my car. The Mitchell Foundation for Foster Care Reform would be Harold's true legacy, a way of transforming his love for one abandoned child into support for hundreds of children who needed someone to believe in their potential. 6 months later, the Foundation opened its second group home, and applications for the scholarship program exceeded our capacity to fund them. Local newspapers ran stories about the Foundation's work, and other wealthy individuals began contributing to our endowment. One article caught my attention particularly: "Local heiress transforms personal tragedy into hope for foster children." The reporter had interviewed several scholarship recipients and group home residents, each of whom spoke about how the Foundation had changed their expectations for their own futures. 16-year-old Marcus Thompson said, "Before coming to the Mitchell Foundation home, I didn't think anyone cared whether I graduated high school or ended up on the streets. Now I'm planning to study engineering in college and maybe start my own construction company someday." 18-year-old Samantha Chen had received one of our first college scholarships and was studying social work at the University of Nebraska. "I want to become a social worker who specializes in helping kids like me," she said. "The Foundation showed me that my background doesn't have to determine my future." Reading these stories, I realized that Harold's death had not been the end of his impact on the world, but rather the beginning of a much larger legacy. Cain's attempt to destroy my inheritance had instead transformed it into something more meaningful than Harold could have imagined. I thought about the emotional journey that had brought me to this point, from the hope of childhood through the pain of abandonment, the escalating betrayals by my biological family, the climactic confrontation with Cain's criminal network, and finally, to the satisfaction of creating something positive from the wreckage of trauma. The 8-year-old girl who had been told she was worthless because of her gender had grown into a woman who could provide hope and opportunity for children facing similar rejection. The inheritance that Frank and Cain had tried to steal was being used to ensure that no child would feel as alone and worthless as I had felt in that group home. As I finished reading the newspaper article about the Foundation's work, I realized that my story had become larger than my personal experience of abandonment and recovery. It had become a testament to the possibility of transformation, the power of chosen family, and the importance of using privilege and resources to lift others up rather than simply accumulating wealth. Harold had saved one child from the foster care system. The Mitchell Foundation would save hundreds, possibly thousands of children over the coming decades. Each scholarship recipient who graduated college, each group home resident who aged out successfully, each child who learned that they deserved love and opportunity, regardless of their biological family's failures, represented a victory over the forces that had tried to destroy my own life. What have you learned about the power of chosen family versus biological family from your own life experiences? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if it resonated with you. Subscribe for more family revenge stories that show how people can overcome betrayal and create positive change in the world. Share this story with anyone who needs to hear that their past doesn't have to determine their future, and that sometimes the greatest revenge is living well and helping others do the same. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that true family is built on love, choice, and commitment, not just shared DNA. May you find the courage to choose forgiveness without accepting abuse, and the wisdom to transform your pain into purpose for helping others heal.